What's cracking, everybody? You're back with Mr. Berger, and tonight we're going to be taking a look at this Royal Hogs Cycle deck. That's right, guys, the piggies are back and they're stronger than ever. People were kind of experimenting with them at release, but then they quickly figured out that, like, yeah, they're cool and there's 4 of them and you can split them, but they're just not that strong. They don't have that oomph kind of, effect that the regular Hog Rider does, or that like a Giant or a Mortar or another win condition does. Now, because of that, they got a slight tweak in the last patch. You're probably aware of this. If you haven't already, make sure that you keep up to date with the most recent patch notes, and you'll see that Cannon Cart and the Royal Hogs were both buffed, and they're both included in this deck. Now, the increase that they got was just a minor attack speed increase. It's like a 0.65 second increase to their first attack on the tower, their first swing only, and that was enough to put them from down here all the way up here, as far as like usage rates and win rates and just overall like popularity goes. So they were like almost never used, and as I mentioned, they were used a little bit when they were first released, and people just didn't quite like them because they just weren't that great. But that minor buff just made it so that they were now way prevalent in the meta. You see them on Stats Royale, Royale API, TV Royale, all that good stuff, and they're definitely all over the place. So this is one of the decks that I found on one of my many sources. I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head, but one of the aforementioned ones that I just mentioned a second ago, and I really enjoy it. And I'm experimenting with some other decks with the Royal Hogs, so definitely expect some other ones in the near future with this, with these Royal Hogs in there. But this was the first one that really stood out to me because I do like cycle decks. I do like Hog Cycle decks. This is very similar to a Hog Cycle deck. Not only that, it includes the Cannon Cart. And the Cannon Cart also got a pretty sizable buff recently, and it's about time. I've been saying for some time the Cannon Cart really needs to get buffed. It's just not that strong, or it wasn't that strong. It was decent, and it was used at like high-end arena, high trophy count, and a lot of pros really liked it, but it just wasn't that great. There was just other replacements, other similar elixir cost cards that were just that much better. Similar to the Royal Hogs, the Hog Rider was just a little bit better, or the Mortar, or the Giant, right? Now, since they got that buff, you'll definitely be seeing the Cannon Cart more and more in a lot of different decks, and expect to see it, combined with the Royal Hogs as well. So let's talk about the kind of different cards in this deck, the overall strategy behind this deck, some opening moves maybe, how to play the Royal Hogs, and possibly some card replacements as well. So the major idea behind this deck, of course, is basically you play it like a Hog Cycle deck, right? You want to outcycle your opponents, their win condition or their counter to your Royal Hogs, and you want to cycle in those Royal Hogs and get them out there as much as you can, similar to Hog Rider. Now, as you can see here, people don't always know how to counter the Royal Hogs because they're not necessarily used to them. An Inferno Dragon, or an Inferno Tower, excuse me, is a great counter to a regular Hog Rider, but he used the Inferno Tower there on the Royal Hogs, and they just absolutely wrecked it. And they only cost me 4 elixir, right? Whereas that Inferno Tower cost him 5. So that's definitely a positive trade for me. And then they proceeded to do damage to the tower as well. Now the Valkyrie, on the other hand, if it's placed properly, it could have done a pretty good job of shutting down those Royal Hogs. But he used it in a spot where I had the Cannon Cart support behind it. And, unfortunately for him, that Valkyrie got distracted by the Cannon Cart. Now here I send in the Royal Hogs again, and I use the poison to support them, and even though some of them are getting chipped away, 1 or 2 of them lives and gets a bunch of chip damage off on that tower. So it's very interesting. It's not super new and original, but I still really like it. It's like an interesting, relatively unique win condition. So let's talk about the cards in this deck and how to play them, when to play them. So of course you got your 2 cycle cards. Let's start with that because that's in the top left on the deck list there. So you got the Skeletons and you got the Ice Spirit. Now, of course, you can always do card replacements. So if you don't like certain cards in this deck, feel free to replace them. For example, if you don't like Skeletons, Bats are definitely a viable option. And I like Bats in a lot of decks myself. But the Skeletons do a good job of being even more cycly because they're even cheaper. They only cost 1 elixir. And they can counter ground units like Princes and Mini P.E.K.K.A.s and P.E.K.K.A.s relatively well. Whereas Bats, will just always get zapped if your opponent is running Zap, and you don't have any other zappable or zap-susceptible cards in your deck. So, think about it, do what you think is best, but most of the people are running skeletons in this deck rather than bats or goblins or something like that. For the Ice Spirit, maybe Fire Spirits, but hey, if you're running a cycle deck, Ice Spirit is pretty core. For the Ice Golem, of course, you could run like a Valkyrie or, you know, a Knight if you want, depending on card levels. But the Ice Golem also makes this deck really cheap. So that's the reason that this particular card is in there. It plays that mini tank role, and it does so making your deck's overall elixir cost even lower, whereas of course if you put the Valkyrie in there, it would be significantly higher, because the Valkyrie costs 4, whereas the Ice Golem only costs 2. Now the Royal Hogs, of course, are very core in this deck. Don't get me wrong, you could totally run like a Hog Rider, or like I said earlier, like a Giant or a Mortar or something in this deck, but the Royal Hogs are really the theme and the main card in this deck, so I wouldn't recommend replacing those. If you decide that you want to run another win condition, there are definitely plenty of other decks out there with other win conditions, but again, I think it would work out pretty well with a Hog Rider too, a regular Hog Rider. Alright, next we got the Hunter. Now the Hunter has kind of slowly crept his way in and out of the meta ever since his release. He's gotten a few tweaks, but they're basically like fixes, where he would like completely miss a baby dragon that was right above him, or something ridiculous like that. So, you know, the Hunter, I think that he's a pretty good card, and he does a really good job of just doing burst damage. I think that he needs to be tweaked a little bit, maybe make him have a deploy time, or his first attack a little bit quicker, because it feels kind of awkward when you deploy him. He has that deploy time, and then there's also like a chunk of time before his first attack goes off, and it just feels really like there's a long time, a big chunk of time where he's susceptible to dying, but then he doesn't have that long of a deploy time, so maybe they should just make his deploy time longer. Regardless, the Hunter is really good in this deck. If you're going to replace him, get another tank killer like a Mini P.E.K.K.A. or something. Just keep in mind that the Hunter is one of the few cards in this deck that can attack air. Oh man, I'm looking at the card list now, and there's like almost nothing in there that can attack air. All you've got is Poison, Ice Spirit, Ice Golem, and those hardly count, you know, right? So it's basically up to the Hunter to kill air. So I would definitely recommend putting like a Musketeer or some other air attacking unit in there, maybe even a Mega Minion, some other tank killer, Inferno Dragon, right, would be a good replacement. For the Poison, you can always go Fireball, and of course for Log, you can always go Zap. That's a matter of preference. If you want to run a heavy spell like Rocket or Lightning, be my guest, let me know how it goes. I'm sure it would work out just fine. But the cheaper spells do a good job of keeping the deck cost low, because after all, once again, this is definitely supposed to be a cycle deck. Now, the Cannon Cart. Cannon Cart, I wouldn't replace it because it was recently buffed, and that's another kind of like theme behind this deck. You know, like, yeah, you can change out your support cards, you can change out your cycle cards, you can change out your spells, but the Royal Hogs and the Cannon Cart, like, those are the two that are really going to come together and just absolutely wreck your opponent, because they were both buffed recently. They're both really strong right now. So, make use of that Cannon Cart. If you want to replace it again, maybe like a ranged support unit, like a Musketeer, or a Mega Minion or Minions or something like that. Now, the Cannon Cart, it has really solid DPS, and you can also use it kind of aggressively. You can place it at the bridge and it runs up pretty quickly, and your opponent doesn't always know how to answer it, similar to the Royal Hogs, because it's a card that is kind of relatively underused and underutilized. You're definitely going to see it more and more here as it becomes more popular because of the recent buff, but up until this point it has been relatively underplayed. So using those kind of off-meta cards like that, cards that opponents haven't quite figured out how to counter all the time, you can definitely play to your advantage. So the Cannon Cart and the Royal Hogs are definitely two examples of cards that are like that. Now see, look at that Hunter there, just absolutely wrecking that Hog before it even connects to the tower, even though it was placed in the pocket. Oh man. So this deck, guys, it's like a Hog Cycle deck, but all you got is those Royal Hogs there instead. Now you can place the Royal Hogs split right in the center if you want, at the bridge, but that's not really how I would play this deck. I play them usually together, more as like a single push Hog Cycle like deck. Whereas in my last video, you could see that I did the, welcome to the split push meta. You can see that I often use the Royal Hogs split in the center there. And again, that can work out pretty well if you're going for a split push, but this is more of like a cheap cycle push deck. You go for small pushes and outcycle your opponent. You're not going for that big, massive double push like with the 3 Musketeers deck, like the one that I showed in my last video. So, that being said, guys, let's go ahead and wrap up this video with talking about the last bit of this replay here. You can see that I play aggressively the Royal Hogs, and even though he's got the minions and the Lumberjack, they still manage to get into that tower and connect and do a good chunk of damage because of that increased first attack speed. Just that first swing gets in there, and they each hit really quickly, and it manages to get that tower down to poison range, and I use the poison to finish off that tower. Alright guys, thank you so much for taking the time to check out my videos. I always appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and have a good night.